Brothers and sisters, thank you for joining today. Today, I'd like to talk about free speech, and really this applies to America and the UK. In the UK, the authoritarian elements of the government have really been running amok lately, arresting all kinds of folk just because they're sending mean tweets or they disagree with the government's position on immigration. Just voicing their opinions can get the police to come chap at your door. I wanted to go ahead and revisit one of my favorite comedians, the great Rowan Atkinson. He had a few words to say a few years ago on free speech in the UK, and I think it's time to kind of dust off his sentiments and see what the great Mr. Bean and the Blackadder have to say about free speech in the UK. So let's give a listen to it, and I'll just kind of comment as we go along.
My starting point when it comes to the consideration of any issue relating to free speech is my passionate belief that the second most precious thing in life is the right to express yourself freely. The most precious thing in life, I think, is food in your mouth, and the third most precious is a roof over your head.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. If you don't have free speech, you really don't have anything.
But a fixture for me in the number 2 slot is free expression, just below the need to sustain life itself. That is because I have enjoyed free expression in this country all my professional life and fully expect to continue to do so. Personally, I suspect highly unlikely to be arrested for whatever laws exist to contain free expression because of the undoubtedly privileged position that is afforded to those of a high public profile.
Yes, there's definitely different tiers in the justice system in the UK and in the US. You're treated differently dependent on what your socioeconomic status is, what your political power is, what your race is. So there are definitely different tiers. It's more than just two-tier care. There's more to it than that. But I think he's right. Because he's a celebrity, no one is going to arrest him for the things that he says. And he's a comedian. Comedians are always saying offensive stuff. My goodness, I don't think the great Benny Hill could actually be on television today in the UK because somebody would be offended.
So my concerns are less for myself and more for those more vulnerable because of their lower profile. Like the man arrested in Oxford for calling a police horse gay, or the teenager arrested for calling the Church of Scientology a cult, or the cafe owner arrested for displaying passages from the Bible on a TV screen.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm sure there was some drink involved, but someone calling a police horse gay, what was the horse offended by being called gay? Or was some Karen offended on behalf of the horse? It's nonsense. And Scientology is a cult? There's a lot of Americans think Scientology is a cult, and it's based over here in America. It really kind of goes back, and thank goodness I live in America because we do have strong free speech laws. It goes back to offensive speech really needs to be protected. Popular speech doesn't need protection because it's popular. No one's going to complain about it. But who decides what's offensive and too offensive to say? That's where you run into some danger.
When I heard of some of these more ludicrous offences and charges, I remembered that I had been here before in a fictional context. I once did a show called Not the 9 O'Clock News some years ago, and we did a sketch where Griff Rhys-Jones played Constable Savage, a manifestly racist police officer to whom I, as his station commander, is giving a dressing down for arresting a black man on a whole string of ridiculous, trumped-up and ludicrous charges. The charges for which Constable Savage arrested Mr. Winston Kadogo of 55 Mercer Road were these: walking on the cracks in the pavement, walking in a loud shirt in a built-up area during the hours of darkness, and one of my favorites, walking around all over the place.
Yeah, so arresting somebody for obviously racist reasons is bad. The sergeant wasn't getting dressed down for speech. He was getting dressed down for actual actions. He had actually discriminated in a way that had physical consequences. He deprived somebody of his liberty by arresting him. This it wasn't just about feelings. And then, of course, Rowan Atkinson, the sergeant, or Rowan Atkinson, the inspector or whatever, dressed him down because his actions were inappropriate. And of course, they're inappropriate. They were racist. Those weren't real crimes. Just as people who are sending mean tweets, those aren't real crimes. And I know the law may differ, but the law needs to change in the UK. It is not right. In the guise of maintaining public order, they've made it so that you aren't allowed to offend anyone, and everything is offensive to someone. Rightfully so, the police have cleaned up their act. In the past, there were a lot of racist policemen and women, and they were harassing people and discriminating people unlawfully. The pendulum has swung too far the other way, and now they're policing thoughts and they're policing feelings instead of actual crime, actual physical action. Definitely the UK needs to repeal its hate speech laws or modify them. They are definitely too broad. You can investigate someone for anything now in the UK that someone says they took offense to under the guise of these silly laws. So yeah, they need to be repealed.
He was also arrested for urinating in a public convenience and looking at me in a funny way.
Uh-huh.
Who would have thought that we would end up with a law that would allow life to imitate art so exactly? Mm-hmm. I read somewhere a defender of the status quo claiming that the fact that the gay horse case was dropped after the arrested man refused to pay the fine, and that the Scientology case was also dropped at some point during the court process, was proof that the law was working well.
No, because it still chills speech. You don't want to be like Miss Allison Pearson and have the door chapped on Remembrance Sunday because of something you put on Twitter over a year ago and didn't even remember. And then the police wouldn't tell you about it. By doing that, you have to think twice next time you say something, because you don't want the police to come over and you don't want to be embarrassed. The only reason why Miss Pearson's case got dropped was because she was a reporter for the Telegraph, and the Telegraph stood behind her and ran stories about the ridiculousness of this. I mean, they impaneled like one of their gold squads or something, like she was an actual terrorist. This is what you do with terrorists. There were like at least 3 police forces involved with investigating her. This is how you chill speech. And she was a journalist of all things, which made it even worse. They're trying to chill the speech of a journalist and get her to say what the government wants her to say. And this really got worse with COVID. The authoritarian tendencies of some elements within the government have gotten far stronger during COVID, and they've remained. And to be fair, this isn't all about Keir Starmer and Labour. Most of these laws were tightened under liberal governments like Tony Blair's, but the conservatives were happy to enforce them too, and instead of getting rid of them. Again, authoritarians like being able to lock people up and throw people in jail.
Ignoring the fact that the only reason these cases were dropped was because of the publicity that they had attracted.
Yep.
The police sensed that ridicule was just around the corner and withdrew their actions. Mm-hmm. But what about the thousands of other cases that did not enjoy the oxygen of publicity, that weren't quite ludicrous enough to attract media attention? Even for those actions that were withdrawn, people were arrested, questioned, taken to court, and then released. That isn't a law working properly. That is censoriousness of the most intimidating kind, guaranteed to have, as Lord Deer says, a chilling effect on free expression and free protest.
Yeah, in the UK today, there are people that are rapists walking free who got slaps on the wrist and maybe community type service, while people who just posted mean tweets have gotten a year or two in prison. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Parliament's Joint Committee on Human Rights summarised, as you may know, this whole issue very well by saying, while arresting a protester for using threatening or abusive speech may, depending on the circumstances, be a proportionate response, we do not think that language or behaviour that is merely insulting should ever be criminalised in this way.
Right.
The clear problem with the outlawing of insult is that too many things can be interpreted as such. Criticism is easily construed as insult by certain parties. Ridicule easily construed as insult. Sarcasm, unfavourable comparison, merely stating an alternative point of view to the orthodoxy can be interpreted as insult.
Yeah, and that's really the COVID thing. Orthodox thought on how to handle COVID shut down a lot of speech that turned out to be true. People complained that there wasn't enough testing of the vaccines. People said, hey, maybe this ivermectin stuff will work. Joe Rogan did that. They tried to shut him down. Famous case in America was the Nazis. So, and I'm not talking about Donald Trump supporters that the liberals think are all Nazis. I'm talking about the card-carrying Nazi party in America back in the 60s. I think it was in the 60s, decided to march through a very Jewish town called Skokie, Illinois, and they were allowed. And the American Civil Liberties Union fought for them to have the right to do it. And I think rightfully so. And they did it because, again, offensive speech is what has to be protected, and who draws that line? It was definitely offensive for them to march through, but if you stop them, then what's next? And so I think the Civil Liberties Union did the right thing there. They would never do that today because they're all controlled by very left-wing folk. And so they only will fight for liberal voices today. And then the right way to combat the Nazi party's speech is with just better speech. Talk about why their ideas are wrong. Get it out there in the open, shine some sunlight on what they're saying. That's the right way to handle this kind of stuff.
And because so many things can be interpreted as insult, it is hardly surprising that so many things have been, as the examples I talked about earlier show. Although the law under discussion has been on the statute book for over 25 years, it is indicative of a culture that has taken hold of the programs of successive governments.
Successive
the
governments.
Reasonable and well-intentioned ambition to contain obnoxious elements in society has created a society of an extraordinarily authoritarian and controlling nature.
Yes.
It is what you might call the new intolerance, a new but intense desire to gag uncomfortable voices of dissent. I am not intolerant, say many people, say many softly spoken, highly educated, liberal-minded people. I'm only intolerant of intolerance. And people tend to nod sagely and say, oh yes, wise words, wise words. And yet if you think about this supposedly inarguable statement for longer than 5 seconds, you realize that all it is advocating is the replacement of one kind of intolerance with another.
That's right.
Which to me doesn't represent any kind of progress at all. Underlying prejudices, injustices, or resentments are not addressed by arresting people. They are addressed by the issues being aired, argued, and dealt with, preferably outside the legal process.
Yeah, and I think outside the legal process is right. It is crazy that Miss Allison Pearson was originally told that she was being investigated for a non-crime hate incident. Why are the police even there? I thought the police's job was to catch criminals, catch baddies. So as soon as their investigation concludes that it's a non-crime, nothing to see here. Move along, mind the gap. Why did they even go to her house? We know the real reason. The real reason was to shut her up, chill her speech, so that she would toe the line in the future.
For me, the best way to increase society's resistance to insulting or offensive speech is to allow a lot more of it.
Yeah, I agree.
As with childhood diseases, you can better resist those germs to which you have been exposed. We need to build our immunity to taking offense so that we can deal with the issues that perfectly justified criticism can raise. Our priority should be to deal with the message, not the messenger. As President Obama said in an address to the United Nations only a month or so ago, laudable efforts to restrict speech can become a tool to silence critics or oppress minorities. The strongest weapon against hateful speech is not repression, it is more speech.
Oh my God. Barack Obama said something that I say all the time, and that's crazy. Side note, Barack Obama, worst president in American history. That's a different episode.
And that's the essence of my thesis, more speech. If we want a robust society, we need more robust dialogue, and that must include the right to insult or to offend. And even if, as Lord Dear says, the freedom to be inoffensive is no freedom at all. The repeal of this word in this clause will be only a small step, but it will, I hope, be a critical one in what should be a longer-term project to pause and slowly rewind a creeping culture of censoriousness. It is a small skirmish in the battle, in my opinion, to deal with what Sir Salman Rushdie refers to as the outrage industry. Self-appointed arbiters of the public good, encouraging media-stoked outrage to which the police feel under terrible pressure to react. A newspaper rings up Scotland Yard. Someone has said something slightly insulting on Twitter about someone who we think a national treasure. What are you going to do about it?
Rowan Atkinson did a good job here with the Reform Section 5 campaign, and he did manage to get the hate law watered down, but it still allows the police to come around for what they consider citing racial hatred. Under that standard, pretty much anything related to a minority or any kind of protected group can immediately be classified as hate speech, no matter what it is. I'm hoping that Rowan will get back on this and try to champion the repealing of some more of these laws, because the police and the government are out of control when it comes to arresting or when it comes to investigating under the guise of hate speech. It's really speech that the government doesn't like.
The police panic and they scrabble around and then grasp the most inappropriate lifeline of all, Section 5 of the Public Order Act, that thing where you can arrest anybody for saying anything that might be construed by anyone else as insulting.
That's right.
They don't seem to need a real victim. They need only to make the judgment that somebody could have been offended if they had heard or read what has been said.
And that's still the standard. Somebody could have been offended. They don't actually have to prove anyone was offended. They don't have to actually prove any real harm to start the investigation. Again, if it's not a crime, they shouldn't be there, and this should not be a crime.
Most ludicrous degree of latitude. The storms that surround Twitter and Facebook comment have raised some fascinating issues about free speech, which we haven't really yet come to terms with.
Nope, we still haven't.
Firstly, that we all have to take responsibility for what we say, which is quite a good lesson to learn. But secondly, we've learned how appallingly prickly and intolerant society has become of even the mildest adverse comment.
Yes.
The law should not be aiding and abetting this new intolerance. Free speech can only suffer if the law prevents us from dealing with its consequences. I offer my wholehearted support to the Reform Section 5 campaign. Thank you very much.
All right, well said, Mr. Bean. So it's bad when even Mr. Bean is complaining about free speech. As I said, the Benny Hill show would not be allowed on the television in today's world. The BBC censors wouldn't allow it. I think he's spot on with everything he said. The way to combat speech you don't like is with better speech. It's with more speech. It's not by shutting down the other voices. Those other voices are also your fellow citizens, and they deserve to be heard too.